reports of missiles raining down on Ukraine after Russian President Vladimir Putin launched a military operation in the Donbass region. He warned Ukraine would be blamed for any bloodshed.
Well, joining us now is General Sir Adrian Bradshaw, a former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander. Well, you know, we've been talking about this for so long, haven't we? People have been talking about it when it wasn't top of the news agenda for a long time as well. Now it seems to be happening before our eyes. If you were still in your position in NATO, what would your gut instinct be to do, and what do you think NATO can do?
Well, the answer to that depends on what you think is going on.
Right.
And Mr. Putin is always operating on several levels at the same time. And we can explore that in a moment. But with respect to Ukraine, it's very clear that the intention is to bring Ukraine firmly back into the Russian sphere of influence. That's effectively been achieved in Belarus, and we've seen Belarus used as a launch point. You know, Putin can use the territory of Belarus for his defense assets in more or less any way he wishes to. It's a client state. He wants the same for Ukraine. And that's what he's geared up for. You know, we've seen him use a combination of coercion and subversion in stage one of this, in the annexation of Crimea, in the intervention into the east of Ukraine, into the Donbass, hidden behind a very inadequate fig leaf of deniability. You know, these are indigenous forces, this isn't regular Russian forces. Nonsense, of course. But now he's come out in the open and his objectives are very clear. The only question is he going to do it all in a oneer, or is he going to do it in another stage and then another stage? You know, stage one was in 2014. My hunch is he's going to do it all in a oneer. Why do I say that? 170,000 ground troops, 110 battalion combat groups assembled all the way round in an arc from the north round the east to the southeast, naval forces in the Black Sea and Crimea region, a considerable air force, and what he seems to be doing now is presumably, from the reports we're getting of airfields being hit, is starting to achieve air superiority so that his ground forces can operate with impunity.
If he does do that, if he does go for it, I mean, as you say, he's amassed a sizable military presence there already. What sort of resistance can the Ukrainians put up, and what can NATO do to help defend their territory?
Well,
or can they?
We need to be very clear about NATO's role in this. You know, NATO forces are not going to be involved in this. That's been very clear from the start. You know, when Ukraine was making signals that they wanted to join NATO, for Putin, this was completely unacceptable. 2014 was about stopping that process dead.
You say they're not going to be. But if we see him march towards Kiev, as you say, Belarus has been the point. We've seen explosions around that area and just south of that, north of Kiev. It looks like he's on a march, whether it be by air or literally with troops, to Kiev and takes it. That is a democracy in Europe that has been invaded and taken. How can NATO then do nothing?
Well, NATO won't do nothing. But what NATO nations will do collectively about this is operate in the political, diplomatic and economic domains, because NATO is not going to intervene militarily in Ukraine. They're not part of NATO, that's the point.
I think one of the things that everybody's sitting back and trying to understand is that it seems like he doesn't care. Like Vladimir Putin has prepared for financial sanctions, clearly, because that's what's been tried, the political sanctions. And as we've been talking about earlier, he is creating this relationship, a very close relationship, with President Xi in China. And actually what the West try and do to try and squeeze him politically and financially doesn't seem to be making a difference.
Well, he's obviously put preparations in place. You know, the response to the 2014 incursion was a unified and strong response from NATO. You know, from a position of quite diverse opinions within the NATO nations, we came together 29 nations at the summit in Wales in 2014 unanimously agreed a package called the Readiness Action Plan. It involved the creation of high readiness forces to deploy to the eastern borders of NATO. It involved the positioning of battle groups in NATO countries on the eastern side, and a package of economic sanctions. And Putin saw that, and he's prepared now for this one.
Yeah, because he's got in place financial links, we assume, everywhere. He's got that relationship with President Xi, which presumably offers financial support as well as quite a big potential military ally. And there's an axis there which maybe gives him confidence to ignore NATO and the rest of the West. So when Boris Johnson says, as he tweeted, the UK and our allies will respond decisively, what response can that be?
Well, the decisive response needs to indicate our absolute rejection of this as a way of doing business.
But a rejection could be not.
But it also needs.
I think what people want to know is you can say, well, don't do it like that, and you can reject it. But if they're not listening, what does that mean? How can we stay uninvolved?
Well, welcome to the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
That's the situation that Putin has created. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It's not subject to that collective defence agreement. What's important to us now, I would suggest, ultimately, is the sanctity of NATO. It's a hard thing to say that Ukraine is lost, but some may conclude that that is the case. I mean, calls for Putin to back off at this stage, frankly, are not realistic. He's not going to do it, and we know he's not. He's amassed forces from every military district. He's got a massive force that will overwhelm, ultimately, the Ukrainian forces. We have, of course, provided some military hardware and training and preparation for the Ukrainians. And what remains to be seen now is how will they cope with what's going to unfold over the next few days. This is going to be a war of maneuver. This is different to the 8 years we've seen in the Donbass of sort of stationary, almost trench warfare.
Bearing in mind what you're saying about the scale of the military presence that they have, what would be your advice to the Ukrainians? Because it seems like if NATO can't get involved militarily, it seems like they're going to be fighting on their own against overwhelming odds.
Well, Ukraine have not put in place some of the sort of preparations that you would have expected from a nation that's about to be invaded by land. You know, they haven't created a widespread obstacle plan. They haven't inserted minefields. They haven't created routes or blown bridges. And part of this was the president not wishing to create panic or bring on a situation which there was still some hope would not happen.
Has he been naive then, do you think?
I wouldn't say he's been naive. He's had, the politics at home to deal with. But now the question is, how hard the Ukrainian forces will fight. A good chunk of their armed forces are fixed facing the Donbass. It's highly likely that Russian forces will effectively encircle them and render them ineffective in terms of influencing the battle for the capital. And what we seem to be seeing is crossings of the Belarusian border, which might indicate that a coup de main strike is heading for the capital. No doubt Putin has, in fact, we know Putin has plans to install his own puppet government because our intelligence released some details of that a little while ago.
In the midst of it, people are going to be injured, people are going to lose life. Putin himself, I understand, has ordered at least 45,000 body bags, presumably for his side. For the people of Ukraine, it's terrifying, and there are going to be innocent victims despite promises of targeting military installations, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, this is the reality of war, sort of what's described as peer-on-peer warfare in the modern age. It's going to be devastating and many lives will be lost. But the implication for us to take on board now is it doesn't stop here. We've got to make sure that Putin understands that when and if he brings Ukraine back into his sphere of influence, and he essentially has re-established the boundary between NATO and Russian forces along the border of Ukraine, Belarus, and that northern piece opposite the Baltics. In other words, right the way from north to south, Russian forces are up against NATO. What then? And Mr. Putin has made it quite clear that the presence of NATO military forces in the former Eastern Bloc is unacceptable to him. We've got to ask, what's he going to do about that in the future?
Do you think he could push on? Do you think he could push on and try? I mean, he's had this long-running, emotional, historical, and many others, I'm sure, in Russia do, concentration of Ukraine being Russian, hasn't he? And that disputed area. But will he stop at other areas that might not have that long historical debate?
Well, my hunch is that at this stage he will stop at the border of Ukraine. And who's to say that he's going to achieve that in a one-er? He may not do it. You know, if the Ukrainians put up a stiff fight, it could be painful. And actually what we do have to watch is for the development of a really effective resistance in Ukraine. Now, if a country of 40 million people develops a really determined resistance, you know, that could take 500,000 troops to pin down. If it's something less, maybe about 40,000. We've got to see how that develops. But in the future, bearing in mind that Putin is operating on a different time frame to Western governments, which cycle every 5 or 6 years, you know, he's here, as far as he's concerned, for the next decade and beyond. What does he do within the next 10, 15 years? What we must ensure is that he doesn't see a window of opportunity that he can exploit against the Baltic states, against NATO members. Because if he does, if he sees a window of opportunity, and if he seizes it, and the time he'll seize it is when his political support back home in Russia starts to wane and he's got to fluff up his credentials again. If he seizes it and there's a miscalculation, then we are at war, NATO with Russia. That is incredibly serious and it can lead to nuclear war. We must not let that happen.
You talk about whether the Ukrainians will be able to muster some sort of resistance. Well, just been announced by the Ukrainian police that 7 people are already known to have died in bombing by Russian forces. Officials say the attack was on a military unit in Podilsk, just outside Odessa. 6 people have been wounded. 6 people have been killed and wounded 7. 19 people are also missing. 1 person has died in the city of Mariupol that they have added as well. So those casualties are starting already. And you wonder whether that galvanises the resistance in Ukraine or whether that has the opposite effect?
Well, that's what I can't assess from here. And when I talk about a resistance, I mean after the fighting war, after the war of manoeuvre, after the seizure of Kiev, if that's indeed what's going to happen, and the Russians have installed a puppet government, what then? Does a resistance emerge in the cities and in the country areas? Do the Ukrainians go into the woods? Do they hunker down in urban areas? Do they mount an insurgent campaign against the Russians? Do they indeed strike back into Russia, into the heartland with terrorism? How determined will that be?
It's hard to imagine why they would when they watched the world allow this to unfold in their eyes. If you were a Ukrainian, you'd be thinking, well, if people were going to help us stop it, they'd help us now.
Well, I think the Ukrainians know that ultimately it's down to them. But if they mount a determined resistance, the chances are they'll get assistance. And the implications of that for us, of course, are profound, because if Putin takes us to be a co-belligerent in what's going on in Ukraine through military hardware provision, through discrete interventions, that sort of thing, then he's going to make it painful for us. And how do we prepare for that in every domain? And what we need to understand now is that the whole of society, our society, will be part of that.
When you talk about that lineup that you fear might happen between NATO and Russia, that if they take Ukraine, as it looks like in your view they might, that could put us in a situation where nuclear weapons could be involved. Is that what you saw in his emotional speech when he said there'd be an instant response? Or is that what you fear he'll use as a threat to get us to back off? Well,
the use of nuclear weapons is always there in the background as a threat. And Russian military commanders have actually articulated that threat in recent months. But I don't think that the use of nuclear weapons is particularly likely in the context of the takeover of Ukraine. In fact, I think it's highly unlikely. You know, the danger with nuclear weapons is if there's a conflict with NATO and things escalate out of control. And, you know, Russia, like the Soviets did before them, have a doctrine of escalation dominance. You know, they'll try to take things to a stage beyond which we don't dare go. That's a real danger for us. So I think we need to compartmentalize slightly what's going on in Ukraine, which is not for NATO military action, overt military action, direct assistance, and what might happen in the future against NATO. And we need to prepare for that day now. It must not be allowed to happen.
Yeah, OK. We're going to have to leave it there. General Sir Adrian Bradshaw, thank you for joining us this morning. Some stark warnings indeed.